everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is former senator and founding member of our Republican legacy, John Danforth. Senator Danforth, I appreciate you coming back on. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Senator, it's great to have you once again because this is a continuation of a conversation we had back in May. A swath of President Trump's tariffs recently faced another legal setback, this time in an appeals court. In a 7-4 ruling, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit said that President Trump overstepped his authority by invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, otherwise known as IEEPA, to impose tariffs. And you signed an amicus brief in this case against the tariffs. So to start off the conversation, what's your reaction to this new legal hurdle?
Well, I think that the court's decision is exactly right. It's important to point out that the court was not talking about whether tariffs are a good idea or a bad idea. That's really not the argument. The argument has to do with our constitutional structure in America. And it has to do with what was in the minds of the framers of our Constitution when they wanted to protect our country against the concentration of power in a few hands, or in this case, one hand. So they created this separation of powers and this structure where there were three branches of government, equal branches of government. And now what's happened is that the president on his own has assumed congressional powers. So the power to tax, the power to impose tariffs now is something that he has aggregated to himself, and he can change at will just by the stroke of a pen. And that's not the way the Constitution has been set up. So I think that what the court did is just right. For those who believe in what's called strict construction of the Constitution, it's hard to read the Constitution in any way other than that the power to tax rests within the Congress, not within the president himself. And then there's something called the major questions doctrine, which the court has developed, which says that in matters of major economic policy and major political policy, if the Congress is going to delegate powers to the president, it has to do so very specifically and explicitly, and it clearly has not done it in this case. So I think the court's decision is correct.
In May, when we had a conversation last on these tariffs, you said a similar thing, that essentially this is a constitutional case and it's pretty cut and dry, and it most certainly will get kicked up all the way to the Supreme Court. Do you believe that the Supreme Court is going to take this case still, A, and B, what do you think that fight looks like once it's in the highest court?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely destined for the Supreme Court. And I can't imagine that the Constitution could be read in a way that gives to the President of the United States on his own the power to essentially impose taxes. I can't understand that, especially given the major questions doctrine of the court. So yeah, I think the court's going to take it, and it's hard for me to grasp how it could come out in any other way than affirming the Court of Appeals.
And as we know, the Supreme Court is conservative leaning, but a leading scholar of constitutional law and politics and a law professor at the University of Maryland School of Law, Mark Graber, said he didn't think that the justices, including Roberts, Amy Coney Barrett, Brett Kavanaugh, or Neil Gorsuch, are too keen on tariffs. And this is what he said, quote, "It won't surprise me if a number of Republicans on the Supreme bench actually jump on this one." He continued to go on to say, "I think this court would love to have a case where it doesn't side with the administration." Do you think that they won't side with the administration, that they could look at this and say, hey, this could be a time where we buck Trump? Or do you think that really matters here?
Well, the job of the court is not to side with or against the administration. And it's not to decide on its own whether, as a matter of economic policy, tariffs are a good idea or a bad idea. That's not the work of the court. The work of the court is to interpret the Constitution, and that's all it is. And as I said, I just don't understand how the Constitution could be read in any other way than what it says, and that is that the power to tax is expressly vested in Congress, not in the President of the United States. Now, on the general question of the effect of the economy, what the Constitution does is to set up a specific way in which legislation dealing with taxes is passed. So under the Constitution, the tax bills have to originate in the House of Representatives, which is that part of Congress most directly connected to the people. So that's the principle of no taxation without representation. So bills are introduced in the House, they're referred to committee, hearings are held in the committee, the bills are marked up, they go to the floor of the House, they are amended or not amended, passed or not passed. If they are passed, they go to the Senate, same process in the Senate, with a lot of hearings, a lot of public debate, and a kind of a complicated way of imposing taxes. But that's for a purpose. It's to say that an economic policy, you just don't have a president waking up one day and saying, well, I feel like imposing taxes today, or I feel like imposing tariffs today. And then maybe the next day he'll change his mind in another stroke of the pen. So it creates tremendous uncertainty in the country if the president can do this on his own, whenever he wants, wherever he wants. And that creates the sort of instability in the economy, which we have right now. And businesses now who are considering investing capital investment in plant equipment, how would they know what to predict? And they can't. So for that kind of almost practical reason, it really is important to stick with the constitutionally established order of things.
Do you think this legal limbo then is almost worse for the economy? Because if the tariffs were in place, businesses and other people could know exactly what to do. If they weren't in place, there's a separate route there. But with this limbo, I mean, people are really confused as to what's going to happen next.
Well, they should be confused because look what's happened. The president decides that he's going to impose tariffs. He makes an announcement. Then he says, well, wait a second, I'm not going to do it right away. I'm going to do it 30 days from now or 90 days from now or whatever. And then I'm going to have separate deals with this country and that country. And I'm the big deal maker and I can decide. And what's to prevent him from changing his mind? I mean, if the president on his own, simply by signing one piece of paper, can change essential economic policy, and can impose taxes, can impose tariffs, and then can decide, whoops, no, I didn't mean that, and change his mind again. How can any business risk investing in plant and equipment? Who would want to build a factory and employ people in the United States based on policy that is fickle and changeable as one that's created simply by executive order?
National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett, he said that if these tariffs, the IEEPA tariffs, are struck down by the Supreme Court, this administration is going to pursue other avenues to keep these tariffs in place, like Section 232. Do you think there's going to be other legal lawsuits, other legal challenges when it comes to these other avenues they could potentially explore?
Maybe. I mean, Congress has provided instances in which the president can impose tariffs for various reasons, emergency reasons, really, but those are clearly stated by Congress. It's not a roving delegation of all taxing power to the president. It's contained delegation. So that's a very, very different matter.
Before you and I jumped in on this interview, I was reading an argument that said that President Trump might not want to win his tariff case because if the tariffs get struck down by the Supreme Court, it could be a win-win for him. One, it gets him off the hook of a tariff policy that economists say ultimately is detrimental to the country. And two, then he could say, hey, my hands were tied. I tried everything I could, but this was up to the courts and the courts ruled against me. Do you think that there's some truth to that argument?
No, I think that's the basic tactic of President Trump, which is to take credit for everything and responsibility for nothing. So sure, yeah. I mean, he's very willing to blame whatever, Federal Reserve, the courts, whatever he can, Joe Biden, anything that comes to his mind, he can blame it. But he's the president. He's the one who did this. He's the one who imposed these massive tariffs globally. I mean, this is not something that's tailored for one particular purpose. These are global, and then they're imposed on some of our closest allies. So I think it's having a negative effect on America's standing in the world and a negative effect on the economy. But that really is beyond the point with regard to the case that will be coming before the U.S. Supreme Court, which is based solely on the constitutional argument, the separation of powers argument, not on whether tariffs are a good idea or a bad idea.
So, will the fact that President Trump says if the Supreme Court rules against this, these will destroy our country if the tariffs are rolled back? The Solicitor General Sowers said this, that the president and his cabinet officials have determined that the tariffs are promoting peace and unprecedented economic prosperity, and that the denial of tariff authority would expose our nation to trade retaliation without effective defenses and thrust America back to the brink of economic collapse, or catastrophe, rather. Does the Supreme Court weigh those types of comments, that charged rhetoric at all, or are they just looking at the Constitution?
Well, they should just be looking at the Constitution. I mean, it's not up to the Supreme Court to be a policymaker on economic policy. It's not the job of the Supreme Court to decide whether the president did something that is, from the standpoint of the economy, a good idea or a bad idea. That's not the job of the court. The job of the court is to read the Constitution and to apply the Constitution to the case at hand.
And you are an expert when it comes to trade policy because during your time serving in the Senate Finance Committee, you chaired the International Trade Subcommittee. So when you're looking at the tariff whiplash we've seen really since April, when you're looking at the legal fights on a swath of President Trump's tariffs, I mean, what do you think this does to his trade policy? And if the Supreme Court strikes it down, does his trade policy completely unravel?
Yes, I think that it would completely unravel. I mean, he might in targeted, narrowly defined ways be able to impose tariffs for the purpose of an economic emergency that really exists with respect to, say, a particular product. He might be able to do that, national security, but not broad gauge tariffs that are global, that apply to countries all over the world, even tiny countries. That's a very different matter.
And do you think that the Republican sides of Congress will pick up the mantle for him? Let's say the Supreme Court strikes this down. And do you think that they would impose tariffs themselves in the way that President Trump wants?
Well, it's harder to do in Congress because, I mean, you would face in the Senate the possibility of a filibuster. So it's harder to do that. Do I think that Republicans would fall in line behind the president? Yes, because that's what they're doing now. I mean, it's as though why have Congress? I mean, it's as though, from the standpoint of the Republican Party is Donald Trump, and he gives Congress their marching orders. So it's it's not clear to me how they justify drawing a paycheck for their extreme inactivity and passivity in all kinds of ways. But yeah, I mean, they would they would fall in line, and they would join him in trying to blame somebody else for the mess. It would be, I mean, it would certainly be a challenge if he has tariffs one day and then suddenly the Supreme Court says, no, these tariffs are unconstitutional. But yeah, I mean, I think that the Republican Party in Congress is Donald Trump.
And then, as someone who served as a senator, I mean, what happens if that mess happens and the Supreme Court says these tariffs are unconstitutional? What does that type of refund look like? What does that type of rollback look like? And arguably, maybe most importantly, what are our allies, our friends and foes abroad looking at us like when they're thinking about trade with the United States?
Okay, I'm not sure how this would be unwound. How this particular egg would be unscrambled. I don't know. I think that's an interesting question for the future. With regard to how our allies view all of this, I mean, all you have to do is look at India. So India now is traipsing over to China and meeting with China and with Putin, and it's created a backlash against the United States that we've done this, and our closest allies. I mean, Canada, we don't have a closer friend historically than Canada. And now, there's this revolt in Canada against their neighbor and friend, the United States. So it's a matter of America's standing in the world, creating this kind of animosity is against our national interest, in my opinion. But that's my opinion. That's not the constitutional issue. The constitutional issue is very, very straightforward, and it has to do with the concentration of power. This is exactly what James Madison, who was the chief author of our Constitution, was concerned about. Madison was concerned about too much power in too few hands. Well, now, if the president is right, he has absolute power. And in one hand, he has got absolute power to do whatever he wants to do. Then he can do it whenever he wants to do it. And he can do it today, and then he changes his mind a week from today. It's a crazy situation. And it is absolutely the opposite of this carefully worked out structure that had to do with containing power so that you don't have, really, in this case, absolute power in the hands of one person.
I know that throughout this conversation, throughout our past conversation, you said, and you continue to say, that this is just cut and dry, black and white constitutional question. So if the Supreme Court does take this up, which all signs, according to you, say that they're going to, I mean, what does that, or what does that look like next? What are the next steps? Is it because you say it's just based on the Constitution, this should be resolved pretty quickly, or is this going to take months and months? What does that timeline look like?
Well, I mean, the Supreme Court can take quite a long time, but I don't think it would in this case. I think it would recognize that, this is a very, very big deal relating to the future of the country and how we handle the situation. So I do believe that the Supreme Court will take it up quickly. Now, quickly relative to how other cases can proceed, that's a different matter. But I'd say it would be a matter of months, certainly not as long as a year, I don't think.
And then my last question to you is, do you think their decision sets a precedent for the way President Trump governs for the next 3 years of his term? If the Supreme Court strikes this down, do you think he plays more within the guidelines of the Constitution? If not,
No,
no.
no, no. I think he views himself as uniquely brilliant and specially gifted, and the people elected him to be president, and that he assumes absolutely as much power as he can assume. So will it change his behavior? I can't imagine that it will. I think his behavior will be the same, and he could create a constitutional crisis, I suppose. He could say, well, as Andrew Jackson was alleged to have said, well, the Supreme Court has decided, let them enforce it. But no, I think he's going to continue to be Donald Trump.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for when and if the Supreme Court takes this up, and what's next for the legal fight for President Trump's tariffs. Senator Danforth, I appreciate the conversation, your expertise and insight per usual, and I hope you can join me once again. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.